If I told you that these three were working together, would you believe me? To answer this question, I'm going to break this down into two parts and you can make an assessment for yourself. In the third and final part, I'm going to show you something that, if I am correct, is totally and utterly crazy. So in a previous video, I discussed about whether Boris was a traitor. In the run-up to the 2019 election, a document was put on Boris's desk in October, the election being in November. The document was about Russian interference, and Boris point-blank refused to release that document.
When will you release the Russian report?
Let me tell you,
this is the report into whether or not there was Russian interference or any kind of influence.
There is absolutely no evidence that I know.
If that's the case, then why not release it?
To show any interference in any British electoral event. And the reason I won't is I see no reason, or the reason I decided not to ages ago, is because I see no reason to interfere with the normal timetable.
The normal timetable? Hold on, that's not true. That is not true.
Going on.
That is not true. Dominic Grieve said it should have been released on October 28th. It was on your desk on October 17th.
There's absolutely no evidence that I've ever seen of any Russian interference in UK democratic processes. Can we make a serious point? I mean, I think that
this is a serious point.
Yeah, sure. I mean,
it's about Russian interference in UK politics.
There's no evidence for that, and I think that you've got to be very careful before you simply cast aspersions on everybody who comes from a certain country just because of their nationality.
For sure.
CNN even released a news report on it and had witnesses that were at the committee meeting.
Sources are telling CNN the Cross-Party Intelligence and Security Committee heard from multiple witnesses, and they all allege Russia has built a network of friendly British diplomats, lawyers, parliamentarians and other influencers across the political spectrum. That is a stark warning issued in testimony to a parliamentary inquiry on Russian infiltration into British politics.
When pressure mounted on Boris, he doubled down, but he changed his language and said no successful attempts.
I've seen absolutely no evidence of successful Russian interference in any electoral event, Mr. Speaker.
Thanks to multiple MPs, including Caroline Lucas, this report was released, and here's what it said.
The UK government have actively avoided looking for evidence that Russia interfered. We were told that they hadn't seen any evidence, but that is meaningless if they hadn't looked for it.
So it would appear that we at least have one Muppet on strings. What about the other Muppet? This is Tucker Carlson, and I think I'm going to have to give you a bit of a background on him. Tucker is a quote-unquote journalist.
We're in journalism. Our duty is to inform people.
And he comes from a very wealthy background. In fact, here's an advert for some of the food that his family produces.
I think I'm going to the bathroom. Wanna come?
Yeah, sure. I don't really have to go, but I'll keep you company.
Where you ladies going?
You are what you eat. So make it a hungry man. With a full pound of meat and potatoes, you can eat like a man and be full like a man. Hungry man. It's good to be full.
And here is someone trying that food, and it is literally food that is out of the movie and book 1984.
You got two little Salisbury steak patties. Mashed potatoes still looking a little bit scary. The Salisbury steak is really good. It's really salty, but man, it's tasty. This is of course not compared to real ground beef or real food. Compared to other TV dinners though, I mean, that's a pretty tasty slab of possibly real meat. Probably not. Well, there we go.
Do you know, I don't think there's a single piece of meat in this stew. Looks like meat, tastes like meat, isn't meat at all. Double plus good.
And all of that seems to explain why he's got such racist views, or at least it's not surprising. Have a listen.
Iraq is a crappy place filled with a bunch of, semi-literate primitive monkeys.
How could you salvage Iraq at this point?
I don't, it's beyond our control. I mean, if somehow the Iraqis decided to behave like human beings or something.
But I just have zero sympathy for them or their culture, a culture where people just don't use toilet paper or forks.
Having listened to everything there, Bear in mind that he's got a bit of a racist attitude, and he seems to extol the virtues, or at least his family does, of living in the book 1984, it's a little bit unsurprising that he had such a positive attitude towards Russia. I'm going to break down two pieces of video footage. One, his interview with Vladimir Putin, the other, his shopping trip in a Russian store, but also his sinister ending to that.
Mr. President, thank you.
The interview starts quite politely, and Tucker goes straight into it and talks about why did he invade Ukraine and why has he changed his reason. Putin goes on a wild speech, essentially saying that because Ukraine didn't exist before 1640, it's not a real country, which means that he's allowed to invade it. And yet Putin said nothing about this until 20 years later.
Well, it was not about that the United States wanted to surprisingly strike Russia. I didn't say so. Is it a talk show or is it a formidable, serious talk that we're having?
Here's the quote. Thank you. It's a formidable, serious talk.
It's a serious talk, okay. You are trained in history, as far as I know.
Yes.
So, I'll allow myself, like, to spend a minute to give you a reference note, a debriefing, if you don't mind that.
Please.
And Tucker doesn't challenge him on any of this. And it gets interesting because Putin goes on to suggest that the reason for World War II happening is because of Poland, and that Poland was collaborating with the Nazis.
In 1939, after Poland cooperated with Hitler, and they collaborated with Hitler actually. We have all the documents in the archive, and Hitler proposed Poland a peace treaty and a friendship treaty, but he claimed that Poland should give the Dansk corridor back to the city of Gdansk appeared. It was renamed. So Hitler asked them to give it amicably. They refused, but still they collaborated with Hitler, and they together partitioned Czechoslovakia.
And Tucker, the historian, journalist, totally ignores that. And this would continue. It's basically giving Putin a lap dance, a horrible, chilling thought of both of them being involved in that, but nonetheless a pretty decent metaphor. It's horrific what he does. It's useless, and of course, it doesn't inform anyone of anything.
That Ukraine, certainly parts of Ukraine, eastern Ukraine, is in effect Russia, has been for hundreds of years. Why wouldn't you just take it when you became president?
I'm not going to go into further detail about this interview because it's a complete waste of time. Essentially, he's just his puppet, as stated earlier, not willing to challenge him on his inaccurate history, but also not talking to him about any of the horrific things that Putin's regime has been doing over the past decades, or even challenging him on people being arrested for being upset and mourning about the death of Navalny, an opposition leader to President Putin.
Honor Navalny so publicly.
In fact, the interview was so terrible, Putin himself slagged off Tucker Carlson's ability to be a journalist.
Почему? Потому что я-то, честно говоря, думал, что он как раз и будет вести себя агрессивно и будет задавать эти так называемые острые вопросы. Я не просто был к этому готов, а я этого хотел. Потому что это давало бы мне возможность также остро отвечать, что, на мой взгляд, придало бы определенную специфику всей нашей беседе. Но он избрал другую тактику. Откровенно говоря, полного удовольствия от этого интервью я не получил.
Is it just me, or does that journalist look like he wants to ask another question to follow up on that, but is too terrified of Putin? In fact, in many ways, what Putin is saying is that he doesn't like people sucking up to him, summed up in the TV show The Office by Michael Scott.
I don't want somebody sucking up to me because they think I am going to help their career. I want them sucking up to me because they genuinely love me.
And this Tucker Carlson Putin anti-love fest continued with Tucker's trip to a Russian supermarket, where Tucker started off by attacking American homeless people.
You put in 10 rubles here, and you get it back when you put the cart back. So it's free, but there's an incentive to return it and not just bring it to your homeless encampment.
The more I watched, the more I realised Tucker has probably never been in a supermarket.
This is designed, I'm figuring this out now, where the wheels don't move, they lock on the grocery cart escalator. Look, Ma, no hands.
This could be for many reasons. His family and himself are millionaires, but it could also be because they've only ever ordered in Hungry Man food.
Which is one thing I can assess pretty well. The low-carb lifestyle has not swept Russia. Thank heaven, because I mean, look at that. It's fresh, too. Look at that. Oh, come on.
So enough of that. It's just weird. Instead, what I'm going to show you is Tucker attacking America.
I went from amused to legitimately angry. So we were guessing what this would cost. Everybody hears from the United States, buys groceries, and we didn't pay any attention to costs as we were just putting in the cart what we would actually eat over a week. And we all came in around $400, about $400. It was $104 US here.
Now what you'd hope is that he'd give an itemized list of what he bought and then he can compare prices in the United States. But what you also would hope for is that Tucker would tell you what the average earning wage is, which he doesn't. And that's $200 US a week. And he's just spent 100, so that's 50% of your income just going on food to feed your family. Cue ominous music.
And that's when you start to realize that ideology maybe doesn't matter as much as you thought, corruption. If you take people's standard of living and you tank it through filth and crime and inflation, and they literally can't buy the groceries they want, at that point, maybe it matters less what you say or whether you're a good person or a bad person. You're wrecking people's lives in their country, and that's what our leaders have done to us. And coming to a Russian grocery store, the heart of evil, and seeing what things cost and how people live, it will radicalize you against our leaders. That's how I feel anyway, radicalized. We're not making any of this up, by the way, at all.
And as I've shown you, he really is making this all up. In fact, he's using the exact same arguments that you would hear from someone who likes Mussolini. The trains run on time, so I think that Mussolini's doing a good job, even though people are disappearing from the streets and being sent into camps. So on to the final part of this absolutely nutty story, where we've got Boris looking like a traitor and Tucker looking like a traitor. Let's have a look at them go at each other for both being traitors. Boris, before his Prime Minister, was a journalist, and he's now reverted to being a journalist, and he wrote an attack piece on Tucker Carlson being a stooge of the Kremlin, despite everything I showed you at the beginning. It's almost as if Boris is trying to clean himself, and Tucker also goes on the offensive.
So I'm over in Moscow, I'm waiting to do this interview, it gets out that we're doing it, and I'm immediately denounced by this guy called Boris Johnson, who was for a short time the Prime Minister of Great Britain. And Boris Johnson calls me a tool of the Kremlin or something. And I'm thinking, well, that's kind of, I mean, his name's not actually Boris, as I'm sure you know. His name is Alex Johnson. He called himself Boris in high school. So the guy who calls himself Boris is accusing me?
There are European academics and former TV directors from Russia all claiming this is a standard tactic of Vladimir Putin. Get two sides to go at each other and make yourself look like the good guy in the middle, or the sensible option. In this particular case, I've got no clue as to what's going on here and why Tucker and Boris are going at each other when they're both implicated in being traitors. As I stated earlier, this is crazy.
So I was annoyed, so I put in a request for an interview with Boris Johnson, as I have many times because he's constantly denouncing me as a tool of the Kremlin. He says no. So I'm thinking about saying I'm getting more annoyed. So I know a lot of people who know Boris Johnson. So I reach out to them. Finally, one of his advisors gets back to me and says, he will talk to you, but it's going to cost you $1 million. He wants $1 million in US dollars, gold, or Bitcoin. No, this just happened yesterday or 2 days ago.
Boris wants payment in gold or Bitcoin. That doesn't sound dodgy. Maybe the police should investigate. The worst thing is, they both seem to be profiteering off what's taking place in Ukraine. And Boris has just demanded £1 million to talk about what's going on in Ukraine and why Boris is a traitor.
And I'm like, he wants $1 million. Yeah. And then he will talk to you about Ukraine. He will explain his position on Ukraine and explain what. So he attacks me without explaining how I'm wrong, of course, or how he's right. This is, by the way, the guy who single-handedly, at the request of the U.S. government, stopped the peace deal in Ukraine 1.5 years ago and is, I think, for that reason, responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. He won't explain any of that to me in an interview until I pay him $1 million. And I said to the guy, I just interviewed Vladimir Putin. I'm not defending Putin, but Putin didn't ask for $1 million.
Except Tucker did defend Vladimir Putin, not necessarily in the interview, but he didn't challenge him on any of the crazy stuff that Putin was talking about. And in the supermarket, he was literally saying, ignore freedom. What's more important is whether or not you can afford food.
So you're telling me that Boris Johnson is a lot sleazier, a lot lower than Vladimir Putin. This is a money laundering operation. A lot of the people involved in it making money from it. And if you're making money off a war, you know, you can deal with God on that, because that's really immoral. Like, that's actually really, really wrong. And a lot of people are, including Boris Johnson.
So at the beginning of this video, I asked the question, if I told you that these guys are all connected and pretty much working for the same boss, would you believe me? Put your thoughts in the comments. Once again, thank you to all my supporters. You keep this channel going and growing. For everyone else, thank you very much. If you'd like to support me more, you can either hit that like and subscribe button, or you can put a donation in. Just look at the link in the description. Thanks for listening. Bye for now.